Welcome to the Lead to Win podcast, the podcast where we explore strategies, mindsets, and stories behind successful leadership and personal development. I'm your host, Bo Bergen. Let's do it. I'm joined by a very special guest today, Mr. Jon Rennie. Jon is a business leader, author, and speaker. He is the co-founder, president, and CEO of Peak Demand Incorporated, a global manufacturer of products for electrical utilities. He served as a naval officer on nuclear submarines during the Cold War and has been leading industrial business for more than 20 years. Jon is passionate about leadership and employee engagement. His articles and blog posts have been read and shared all over the world. He believes that leadership can make a significant difference in the performance of any organization. His leadership books, I Have the Watch, Becoming a Leader Worth Following, All in the Same Boat, Lead Your Organization Like a Nuclear Submariner, and You Have the Watch, A Guided Journal to Become a Leader Worth Following, are Amazon bestsellers. Jon, welcome and thanks for coming on today.
Thanks, Bo. It's good to meet you.
Yeah, tell me a little bit more about your background as a naval officer and how that experience has kind of helped you transition into the business world.
Yeah, believe it or not, I'm one of those strange guys that actually did what they dreamed to do as a kid. So I was fascinated with the Navy. I was fascinated with underwater warfare. And I remember telling my high school guidance counselor that I wanted to be an officer on nuclear submarines. And how do I do that? And so, he, to his credit, he didn't know how to do that, but he figured it out, helped me, guided me to get to that role and to that goal. Which one was to go to an engineering school, study engineering, and then get accepted into the nuclear Navy program, which I did. And so I served for 5 years on the USS Tennessee right out of college. And it was one of these situations where I was thrown into a leadership position right off the get-go. So come right out of college, they put me through a year and 3 months of additional training. And then I was there on board the USS Tennessee as an officer. So we had 155 people that went out to sea every time we went on deployment, and there were 15 officers. So I was one of those 15 officers. And one of the things is in a submarine is it's very tight quarters. And so you really get to know people. You get to know the people working for you. You get to know the people you're working for, and you build relationships. And the mission is always very clear, right? Everybody knows what the mission is, and we all know we want to do the mission and get home safely, right? And the other thing is that everybody's important on a submarine, right? Even the most junior sailor could turn the wrong valve and we all die. So there's this shared sense of responsibility and vulnerability. So we're vulnerable together. And I think that was a great place to learn leadership because we were all in it together. In fact, my second book is called All in the Same Boat because we were literally all in the same boat underneath the ocean. Everybody wants to kill you. The Soviets wanted to kill us. The ocean wants to kill us, but we had to try to work together to be able to do our mission, get home safely. So those lessons really stuck with me when I left the Navy and I started running manufacturing businesses. The idea of how do we get all in the same boat, focused on common objectives, common missions, and doing it together.
Yeah. So I'm an extremely claustrophobic person. And, just the thought of being in a submarine underwater, it sends chills down my spine. Talk about the mindset that it takes to do that and, kind of what it took to stay focused on the task at hand. I don't know how long you were on a submarine for, but just kind of talk about the mindset that involved.
So we would leave for about 90 to 100 days. We would be submerged, no port calls. We're talking about just at sea, hatches shut, below the surface. So no sunlight. In our case, it was an all male crew. So no women, no sunlight, no beer. So that was it for 100 days. Right. But they kept us very busy. You were very busy. You stood watch, you managed your team. You worked on becoming qualified in various watch stations. So we were very busy. And so you never really had a chance to think about where you were or and like you said, being claustrophobic and it wasn't until I was fairly senior and I was making my 7th deployment that I actually had some free time. And when I did have free time, that's when it kind of freaked you out a little bit, right? I'd go up to the control room and look at the chart, and we're like dead center in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, like hundreds and hundreds of miles away from, the nearest ship or the nearest asset. And we'd be hundreds of feet underneath the ocean. And I'm thinking, well, this is great. There's 24 nuclear weapons, a nuclear reactor, and a bunch of 18-year-olds. I mean, what could go wrong?
Right.
So if you had the chance to think about it, you could get really messed up. But most of the time we didn't think about it. We just did our jobs.
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't be cut out for it. I can tell you that right now. So, general leadership question here, because I'm curious. Off the top of your head, what are some leadership topics? And I know you run a leadership podcast. What are some topics that are relevant right now that leaders kind of need to take notice of?
I think the big thing that I've seen emerge from the pandemic is the fact that there is no stigma attached to having many jobs in your history, so you can jump jobs here and there. And the other thing is remote work has been it's become more mainstream now. So employees have the ability to quit if they don't like working for you and go find something else without much stigma attached. And they also can, if they're not interested or engaged with what you're doing, they can do this thing called quiet quitting. They can sort of drag their feet, do what they need to do, especially if they're working from home, right? And not put the effort in. And so more than ever, leadership is necessary. If you want to attract and retain top talent, then you have to be a great leader. So more than anything, I think that shift has really happened. And so many leaders, many managers, I should say, are not up for the task, right? So they've used to running things, like, oh, you can't leave. If you leave, you'll never find another job like mine. And so they typically tend to think that managing people is not that important. You do what I say, type of thing. But I think they're realizing soon more than ever is that they're having high turnover, they're having low engagement, and they're having a lot of quiet quitting happening because employees don't care. They're like, look, if you don't treat me well, I'm not going to treat you well. So it's interesting that there has been a shift. So I'm 56 years old, and I would say when I first came into the corporate world, right after I left the Navy, it wasn't that way. So the power was always in the employers, but now the power is with employees. And so leaders have to stand up and take notice.
Yeah, very relevant nowadays. And sometimes it's funny. A lot of people covet those work from home jobs, but man, I don't know if I could do it. I don't know if I have the personal, discipline to operate at a high efficiency day to day on my own. I don't know if I could do it, but more and more people are moving that way.
Yes.
Speaking of employee engagement, I was recently reading one of your blog posts, and I briefly wanted to touch on because it kind of stuck out to me. It was about the employee initiative or lack thereof, and how some employees are lacking that initiative and showing they're not interested in who employs them and what they're doing on a day-to-day basis. You talked about how leaders today are too busy to lead, and that could be the cause of some of that. Can you expand on that a little bit and discuss maybe a few strategies that leaders can take to have that people first mindset?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that one of the things that happens when we hire young, talented people in our company is they're excited to be there, right? So nobody on day one is disengaged. They're 100% engaged on day one. And what happens? We typically tend to take these young employees that we just hired, that maybe just graduated, they worked their tail off to get some advanced degree or some qualification to come work for my company. They're a CPA or they're a PE, or they've worked really hard. They come to my company and we give them a cubicle, right? And we give them a computer. And what we do is we give them grunt work. And so we tell them, we don't give them anything that anything where they can break something. So we give them all the easy tasks, the grunt work, and we basically tell them you got to earn your spot. We're going to wait. You got to wait. You got to earn your keep until you're able to make those big decisions. And the problem is that these are very talented people, and they just do this grunt work for years and years, and eventually they become disengaged, disillusioned, and they're like, why didn't even come to work here? This company sucks, and they go find another company, right? So part of our job as leaders is to take that highly engaged and excited employee and never let that go, right? And make sure that they can stay excited and stay engaged. We give them projects that have risk. We give them opportunities to showcase their skills. We take risks, right? I like the fact that in the Navy they gave us opportunities to fail in a controlled manner. So they had these watches called, you were the junior officer of the watch. So like as an officer of the deck, I would be the junior officer of the deck, and I would be underneath another officer of the deck. And they put me on the scope, and they had me go to periscope depth and submerge the ship. And I would make mistakes. And then we would stop everything, and we would review. Okay, what'd you do wrong? How'd you learn from it? Failure was a powerful teaching tool in the Navy, controlled failure, because failure is we have such an emotional reaction to failure that we learn quicker when we fail. We never get young people a chance to fail. And so they never get a chance to push the limits of their skill sets. They never get a chance to work underneath a mentor. And so they get disillusioned and they quit. And so I think the key there is to keep people excited from the day they come into your company until they retire, if you can do that.
Yeah. And nobody hires an employee that's not excited about working there, and it's
Yeah.
like you said, it's our job to nurture and guide and use that excitement to benefit the group as a whole. And I like what you said there. So let's get into the meat of today's conversation. I like to talk about topics like this with especially military people or former military people, because from what I've heard, I haven't served, but I admire those who do. Consistency is vital to, really any aspect of life, but the military especially. So I figured that consistency would be you'd have a little bit of insight into some consistency. So as leaders, at least in my experience, sometimes we have a to-do list. Most of the time we have to-do lists and things like that. We go into work thinking that I'm going to get this, and this done, and I'm going to go home and relax and no problem. But in reality, we all know that when we get hit with things that, we don't expect, we got an employee that comes in, has a problem, whatever, we know that that's going to happen. And we might have those things that bump the things that were on our to-do list all the way down to the bottom. We got to take care of this right now. How can leaders, balance between being consistent and also having to adapt to the evolving circumstances every day? And how can they, navigate that dynamic effectively?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. One of the things I do talk about in my books, and if you follow me on Twitter, I'm always tweeting like little leadership wisdom things. But the idea is, I always say that leadership is a people business, not a paperwork business, not a to-do list business, not a get email zero business, right? So we like to think that we can control our world, right? And so a lot of times people who are managers, sometimes they're the top person in their department, and they get promoted to management, and so they're used to being an individual contributor, and then when they get into a management role, they continue to be a doer because that's what their comfort zone is, right? And so we tend and that's generally a problem because they continue to do, and a lot of times their people don't ever see them. So when you get promoted to management, you have to make a fundamental shift, is that you are not a doer, you're a leader. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't have tasks to do, but you've got to make sure that you're not spending all your time doing tasks and not dealing with the people that work for you. So how do you do that? Well, first of all, when it comes to consistency, is that so routines and habits are really important, very critical. So the other thing is you have to know your body. And that sounds kind of funny, but when are you most productive, right? For me, I'm super productive. I'm super creative up until about 1 in the afternoon. At that point, I have to focus on just doing grunt work. If I've got some, and again, I own my own manufacturing business. There's a lot of grunt work that I have to do, and I try to do that in the afternoon. So part of it is set up your schedule to where you can maximize the performance of your body. So that's part of it, right? And the other thing is how much of the things on your to-do list can you delegate? And the more that you can delegate, it does two things. One is it gives your people a chance to step up and show that you trust them. And two, it helps clear your plate of the doing work so that you can focus on the leading work. And I would say this is when you're at that point where you're least productive, like I am sometimes in the afternoon, that's when I walk around and I talk to people and I see what's going on in the business. And so I spend a lot of time on the shop floor talking to people in the afternoons because that's when I'm least creative and least productive.
Yeah, good stuff. How can leaders maintain that consistency and maybe their decision making to build trust among their team members?
Yeah, so this is a decision making is a big part of what we do as leaders. So it's one thing that we can't delegate. So we have to make the call. So one of the things that's really important, and especially if you're trying to generate a workforce where people are, where you see people as important. So part of that, and so I always say is that the collective wisdom of a team is much higher than one individual leader. So as much as you can, try to get input from your team on decisions that you're about to make, right? Because it can affect them. So I like to try to ask, or depending on the situation, but I try to get input from my team members to say, we've got the situation. There's a couple of choices I could go. What do you guys think, right? So I like to get that input. But at the end of the day, we have to make the call. There's no one can delegate. We can't delegate decision making. So one of the things I like to do is make decisions fast. And then if it's wrong, fix it along the way. So that was my first CEO was very big on that. He said, if you make the right decision, that's good. If you make the wrong decision, that's okay. He said, what will get you fired is making no decision. So I think it's incumbent on us is to put the rudder in the water, steer the boat in the direction that we think we're going to go. And if it's a problem, and we have to make corrections, then we make those corrections. But we need to be decisive as leaders.
Yeah. And following up on that, how important is it to be humble and, kind of self-aware as a leader? You're not going to make all the right decisions. But how important is it to be transparent to the people that you lead and be
Yeah.
humble about the decisions that you make?
Yeah. So humility is a big part of the mindset to seek input from others, right? So I got that. I got that on my first role as a manufacturing leader. So I got assigned my first manufacturing plant at just 32 years old. I was the youngest plant manager in the 40-year history of this manufacturing plant. And it wasn't on purpose that I was humble. It was I'm humble because I've never done this before. I've never run a manufacturing plant before. And that's when I realized that, you know what, all of the knowledge to run this business successfully resides within the people in these four walls, right? And so by that very nature, I learned to okay, how do I engage people, talk to them, get their input, to be able to help guide those decisions. And I think two things happen. One is the employees were excited that I was asking questions and I was curious and I wanted their input. And the second thing is, is that they saw why I made decisions. So I would explain, okay, I've listened to all of you, but we're going to go this way for these reasons. And it's one thing that we don't do enough of as leaders is the why behind what we're doing. If we can explain the why, oftentimes you get better buy-in because I think people are curious, right? And a lot of times too, how many times have you been in a situation where you're like, well, that doesn't make sense. Why is she doing that? Why is he doing that? Right. And so if we give the why, it oftentimes helps people with, oh, okay, well, that makes a lot of sense now that I know the why behind that decision. So I think explaining that why is critical as well.
Yeah. Have you noticed, especially nowadays with such a digitally focused world, everybody's got all the information they need in their pocket. It seems like people are becoming more and more transactional by the day, which transactional I mean, they need that why. If you tell them to do something, it's no longer, I'm going to do it because my boss said so, or,
Yeah.
they just, they don't no longer just willingly do it because they're supposed to. They have to know
Yeah.
kind of why they're doing it. And, have you noticed that a lot in recent years, more and more so?
Oh, yeah. So I'll say this. I got a little phrase: "If forced compliance leads to defiance." So when you're trying to force people to do things, the first natural reaction we're like is like, "No, I'm not doing it." That, at least that's me. Like, you tell me to do something, I'm not doing it, right? But I think if we can explain the why behind it, like, give you an example. So I run a manufacturing plant. We have forklifts. So one of the things I require is that we wear seat belts on the forklift. It's a safety reason, right? If something happens to that forklift, right, and it topples, it can topple on top of you and it'll crush you. They're very heavy. So if I see somebody without a seatbelt, I'll say to them, "Hey, can you get your seatbelt on? I don't want you to get hurt." And that's a why. There's the why behind it. I don't want you to get hurt. That's the reason. It's not about, I don't want to get written up, I don't want an OSHA violation, or just do it or I'll write you up. It's, I don't want you to get hurt. That's a different message. It's the why behind the reason for compliance, the reason for asking people to do certain things.
Yeah.
It's very important. Yeah.
And more people buy in. You mentioned buy in. If they know you care, you give them the why, they're going to buy into what you're doing and what the organization's doing. I believe that consistent communication is, and to have a strategy for that is crucial for any organization to operate efficiently. In what ways have you seen consistent communication contributing to, effective leadership?
Yeah. So I would say this, and this is talking from a guy who's been leading people for 30 years, is that communication is like marketing. And they say, yeah, a customer has to hear it 5 to 7 times before they remember it. Employees are the same way, and you have to give it to them in multiple different ways. So if you say have one all employee meeting, you make an announcement, guess what? About maybe 10% of your employees are going to remember you made some sort of announcement. So you have to reinforce that. So that's what's important about consistent communication. So, for example, in all the years, 30 years I've run manufacturing businesses, I've always had all employee meetings every month, right? And then I have stand-up meetings every morning. So stand-up meetings are shorter. They're definitely, meant more for operational reasons. But the monthly is to review the business. How is it doing? What's the focus going into next month? So those are really important. But those are all like top-down communication. So, and one of the things I found is really important is to try to get that bottom-up communication. And so formally, I do it with what they call birthday meetings. And so every month, so like people who have January birthdays, we're going to get those people together. We have a roundtable discussion. So, and the questions are typically what's working, what's not working. And if you were in my shoes, what would you do this month? Right. And so you have those conversations. And I actually post the minutes of those conversations in the shop floor so the people that weren't in the meeting can hear what was discussed and what was talked about. So those are some formal ways, right? But I also think it's really important that we keep the informal channels open. And so that's why I do spend a lot of time around my employees in their work environments. And when I'm in those situations, I listen more than I talk. So I want them to ask me questions. And you might say to yourself, well, if I have 300 employees, you only talk to 2. How is that effective? Those 2 people talk, right? And the word gets out. Like, oh, Rennie was just out here and he's saying we're working on this new project or what have you. So I use in the Navy, the rumor mill was the most effective means of communication. Leaders, use your rumor mill. You can use the rumor mill to get information to your employees.
Talking about the culture of your organization, and all this ties back to consistency, but what role does being consistent as a leader, sending consistent messages, being consistent in just your actions as a leader, what role does that play in the overall culture of the organization?
So I think it's really important as a leader because all eyes are on you, right? So that's one of the things I learned in the Navy is there was no escape from you're on stage 24/7 for 100 days, right? So everyone's watching everything you do, right? And so the idea is that you have to manage the expectations of your employees, right? So if you're consistent with your approach, right, You don't fly off the handle when bad news comes, right? You are you're steady with your emotions. You're curious. You ask questions. So people can expect your reaction to things, or your how you're going to respond to when there's bad news or when there's problems. So one of the things that's really important is to send those signals by through consistency. So when someone brings you bad news, how do you react, right? And how do you deal with that? Because how you deal with that is going to get out to the rest of the employees. Like, oh, don't go in there. You know, he's pissed off. I mean, I've had many angry bosses, right, who are very emotional and they're up and down all the time, and you had to walk around with kid gloves all the time because you never knew what they were going to do. And so I think being consistent is this idea of managing the expectations of your employees. They know how you're going to react. They know what's important to you because you've said that, and not only said that, you've acted in a way that's consistent with that. So in other words, if you say on-time delivery is really important here. We have to be on time to our meetings as well. And if you say that, you have to do that. You have to be a person of character. So your words have to mean something. And when you do that over time and you're consistent with that, they know they can trust you because you're a person of your word, and what you say, you do what you say. And I think those are some really important things. Be consistent, do what you say, manage expectations.
Essentially leading by example.
It really is. I mean, I tell you what, I can tell you that just over the years, I can tell you that people are watching everything you do, and so I will purposely do things to signal what it was important, right? So, like for example, I'll be in the plant, and I'll see a piece of paper, and I'll make it like, oh, a piece of paper, and I'll make it a big deal that I picked up a piece of paper off the ground because because people are watching me, whether I know it or not. They're looking between their machines, and there's Rennie's out in the plant. So I'll do something to say this is important to me. We're not going to we're going to clean up after ourselves, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's just leading by example, but also knowing that everyone's watching you. How can you signal what's important?
I would say most people, and this is just a personal opinion, are, we talk about visual learners or auditory learners. Man, if somebody sees something, I feel like that sticks more than other ways. You can send out as many emails, you can post as many posters on the wall with your expectations, but man, if you are acting on those every single day and emphasizing those, man, that's gonna stick a lot better, in my opinion, than some emails and some posters. So,
Yeah, exactly.
So, what are some challenges that you've seen um, facing leaders trying to maintain consistency for the people that they lead, and how can they overcome those challenges?
Yeah, I think it's I mean, just in terms of like, I think things have changed, right? So one of the things that I'm seeing a growth in is what I would call stakeholder capitalism. So for years, from the 80s and 90s, we had shareholder capitalism, which meant maximize profits, maximize value for your shareholders. That was the shareholder primacy was the most important thing. It was make money, send it to your shareholders, everything's good, right? That was all we had to do in the 80s and 90s. But it's shifting, right? It's changing now. So now, when I say stakeholder capitalism is important, because employees have a voice, your customers have a larger voice now, your shareholders have a larger voice, the communities you operate in have a larger voice now. So it's much more difficult now as a leader because it's not just about profits, it's about living your values consistently. So if you take a look at the amount of employee protests that have occurred from the pandemic to now, it's unprecedented in the history of business. And what it is employees saying, you state our values are X, but you're doing Y, you're performing Y, and we're not going to stand for that. So being consistent with the values that you claim as a leader that you believe in is much more important than ever before. So you can't get away with lying, cheating, stealing, doing something to the environment because people are going to hold you accountable. Your employees are going to hold you accountable, your shareholders, the community. There's much more activism than ever before. So I'm just, and you should do the right thing all the time. But I'm just saying right now, it's much more important that you do the right thing for your employees, for your customers, and for your communities.
What's the old saying? I think it's with great power comes great responsibility.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say this too is that leadership is hard. And if you don't want to get involved in something that's really hard, and if you don't care about people, or if you don't people issues make you bother you, I mean, just don't go into leadership. It is a hard business, and everything is on you. You're the captain of the ship, and so you're responsible for everything, good or bad, that happens on your watch. And so it's not for the faint of heart. Don't go into it because you think, oh, I'm going to make more money. Well, maybe, but you also have a lot more responsibility. And so, you, as you said, you have a lot of responsibility. The careers and even lives of the people working for you are your responsibility. So don't do that lightly.
Mm-hmm. So, talking about change within an organization, whether it's personnel, staffing, leadership change, it can sometimes it definitely has an effect on team morale, whether it's good or bad. Talk a little bit about the importance of having that consistency. Maybe it's a system in place or just protocols. How important is it for that consistency to be there through whatever changes happen within the organization?
Yeah, change is one of the hardest things that we do as leaders, and because people don't like change, right? And you might say, "Oh, I love change." No, you don't. Nobody likes change. We like things the way they are, right? So anytime you're going to change something, whether it's good or bad, so this is kind of important. So a lot of times we have to do change projects that might affect employees in a negative way, but sometimes we're doing things that are great for employees, right? But it's different, like you're putting in a new ERP system that's going to be so much better than this old, outdated piece of equipment we have. It might be good for the employees in the long term, but in the short term, they're like, but I understand the old system. I knew I had to hit the side of the cabinet to make it work. I was used to that, right? So anytime we go through change, we have to recognize that it is an emotional experience for our employees, right? And we have to manage the emotions through the change process. Don't forget about that, because we tend to, in change projects and what have you, is we tend to think about the nuts and bolts of it all. But really, what's really going to be important to you is the emotions of the people affected. So one of the things that, from a consistency standpoint, that I like to do is to talk about the things that are not going to change, right? What are the things that our employees can cling on to that, okay, we're going to be putting a new ERP system in, but here's the deal. Okay, we're not going to be changing X, Y, or Z. Here's what's going to stay the same. And that gives them something to kind of hold on to until they can get to the other side of the river, right? Because the river is going to be rough. There's going to be a lot of unknowns, right? But we're going to get to the other side. Here's what the other side looks like, and here's what's going to stay the same. So give them something to hold on to until they get to the other side. So I think that's really important, is to think about the emotional impact of your employees for any change project that you work on.
Yeah, that's really good. I come from the world of education, work in a school, and we tell, new things are coming out for teachers all the time. It seems like
Yeah.
a new software or what have you. But, I think a very important thing for anybody that's leading young people, there is things that will not change no matter what's added to your plate. Those kids are always going to be there. They're always looking to you for guidance and support. And your job is to nurture them and make them better people when they leave you. And that's great advice for anybody that's really any leader. The people are still there. That's always going to stay the same. And I think that's good to have in the forefront of your mind whenever you make changes or have to make changes. So that's really good. Finally, last question on consistency here. People always are hungry for feedback, especially from their bosses or their leaders. I always want to know how good or bad I'm doing. And I think about, I have two young kids at home, and they're always looking for validation on, maybe they put together a Lego and it's like, hey, what do you think of that, Dad?
Yeah.
I think of kind of employees the same way. Not that they're childlike or anything like that, but we're always looking for some kind of validation, whether it's did I do a good job or bad job. In what ways have you seen consistent feedback and even recognition of employees contribute to a positive work environment?
It's a great question, and I'm one of those guys that I don't believe in the annual appraisal or the annual performance review, because I think it's not timely, right? It happens once a year, and B, it's become in most companies a bureaucratic process. It's a check the box thing. And I remember sitting with my bosses over the years, and they're just like, okay, I have to write this. You have to sign it. Or like, okay, yeah. And then they go back to work, and you go back to work, and it's not really true feedback. True feedback is timely, right? And it's like you said, like, children, it's timely. You don't tell your kids, I'll get back to you in a year, and I'll evaluate you for 365 days and I'll let you know. No, it needs to be timely, and it needs to be consistent on both sides. Like, and again, it's the positive reinforcement. Like, hey, I really like what you did on this project. You dug into it deeper than I expected, and I really appreciate that. Or you might say, hey, I like what you did there, but the meeting went way too long, right? You've got to get a little more concise. That way you're going to keep people's attention span. So give them that that reinforcing feedback as well. So I think it needs to be consistent and needs to be regular, and you need to be having an ongoing dialogue. I always saw that, like, annual appraisals would come out and people would get bad news, and they were always surprised by it. I was like, it's like, why were they surprised? It's like, because I've never really told them they were doing bad, and so it should never be a surprise when you're not performing up to speed. And it shouldn't be a surprise if you're not, if you're doing really well. You should know that as well too. So I remember I had a boss once. He was my boss for about 3 years. He never really told me I was doing a good job. I just kept doing what I was doing because I thought it was the right thing to do. He never really gave me any positive feedback or negative feedback. Basically, gave me no feedback. He left the company after about 3 years, and he reached out to me in an email, and he said, can you send me some of the information you're doing on lean manufacturing? He's like, I really liked what you were doing. And I'm like, it would have been nice to tell me that, sometime in the process, because I assumed I was doing the right things, but you never gave me any feedback, And don't be like that. Don't be like the boss that only communicates to you after 3 years, and after he leaves the company. That's just not a good place to be. So be consistent, be timely, and be consistent on both sides, positive and, and also, not negative, but reinforcing. Here's how you can even be better. That was a great presentation. Here's how it could even be better. And it's our job. Typically, if we're a leader, we're older, maybe a little more experienced. We've seen life, a little more of life. We need to pass it on to our people.
I want to ask about some of your books.
Yeah.
I think I definitely get the underlying theme of, naval submarine stuff, things that you've kind of learned in the military, which is cool. It's kind of your brand. And I really like the titles of your book, but, kind of pick one that, maybe I'm listening to this and I'm like, man, I like what this guy's saying. I'd love to read one of his books. What one of your books would you recommend to one of my listeners first?
Yeah, I think my most popular book is called I Have the Watch. It was the first book I wrote. It's got 22 short stories of how to be a people-centric leader. And it comes from my stories from the Navy, stories from I ran 8 manufacturing businesses in corporate, and I run one now. So my 9th manufacturing plant. So I've been around people, I've been around leading people, and I share some of those stories. And for whatever reason, that seems to be very popular. It's a short book. It's less than 200 pages, so it's kind of easy to read. And it's being used in a lot of places to do leadership training. So, like, a lot of police departments are using it for their leadership training for those going into leadership in the police force. I'm finding out more and more police forces around the country are using it. So it's an easy read and has a lot of good, I would say, common sense, practical advice for leaders to become a more people-centric leader. In that book is where I introduce the concept that leadership is a people business. And I have a thing called the leadership triangle, which kind of helps you. How do I lead people? What's the right way to lead people? There's a thing called a leadership triangle in there that kind of lays it out really easy. And if you always think about that leadership triangle, then you're always going to make the right decisions when it comes to your business or whatever you're running.
I'll definitely have to check that out for sure. I like short books that are easy to read, and I feel like I'm getting stuff done. I'm getting better from it quickly, and so yeah, I'll have to check that out. Final question. I've kind of turned this into my signature question, if you will. That's the only word I could
Okay.
come up with it. But at the end of the day, when this is all said and done, what do you want your legacy to be, and what do you want to be remembered by?
Well, I think for me, I'd like to be remembered as the best boss that people worked for, right? I want them to say, I remember working for Jon. He's the best boss I ever had. And that's something I've always, for most of my career. And right now I'm working on a doctorate. And I think at some point I'll sell my business and move into teaching full time at the college level. But I want people to remember me as the best professor they ever had. And that I learned more from him than anyone else. And what I'm trying to do is combine 30 years of practical experience with the academic credentials to be able to say, okay, here's what the academics say, here's what I've learned, and I want to be that professor that can give you the academic and the practical advice for you to be successful. So at this point in my life, I'm 56. It's all about paying back now. It's all about helping others now, reaching down and helping others up. That's what I want to do now for the rest of my life, and is helping others. I've been in the trenches as a young person. I'm no longer a young person. So I want to help those that are in the trenches as young people be more successful.
Yeah, that's a great mixture, having the experience and the education to back it up. And I think, I think back to a college professor I had. He was an economics guy, and I didn't know anything about economics, but I listened to every word he was saying because he was practical and he had the experience, and kind of did what you're planning on doing. Is, he worked for years in his industry, and he's wanting to pass some of that knowledge on to people. And I loved what he was all about, and that's a good mixture to have. So I think you're on the right track to leaving a lasting legacy for sure. Well, Jon, I appreciate you coming on today. I really enjoyed your insight, and the consistency piece is so vital in every walk of life. And, I hope my listeners can grab bits and pieces of this and apply it to their situation, whether they're leaders or not. Consistency works for anybody. The more consistent we can be, the more impact we can have on people. And I look forward to following you, and I definitely look forward to reading your book. Appreciate you coming on today.
Thanks, Bo. I had a lot of fun.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Lead to Win podcast. If you're listening this week, make sure to drop a rating on whatever app you're listening on. I'd love to hear from listeners and make this podcast even more relevant to you. Also, make sure to follow the Lead to Win podcast on social media. We're on Facebook, X, Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok. Give us a follow and feel free to share the content. Again, thanks for listening this week. I'm your host, Bo Bergen. See you next Tuesday.